When Sean Scott meets Wendy Ellis in high school, it's love at first sight.
She was a cheerleader. She was very pretty, especially those amazing blue eyes.
With Wendy by his side, Sean strives for an elite military career.
I had been accepted by West Point.
West Point is the country's most prestigious military academy. Very few people actually make it all the way through and graduate.
But Wendy's demands put Sean on the defensive.
You're talking about a guy that won 2 Bronze Stars, and he's thinking everything's okay on the home front.
She could very much damage his entire career. He could be court-martialed.
I was terrified of what was going to come next.
And the final assault is devastating.
You never think that a person could be capable of something like that.
The enemy was not abroad. The enemy was in his own household.
I was born in Toccoa, which is also a Cherokee word for the beautiful. It's a small town, so you see everybody, especially from middle school through high school, almost every day.
Sean Scott grows up as a devout Southern Baptist in the small town in Georgia where his parents meet in 1973.
My mom got pregnant, and they got married out of a sense of obligation to their Christian faith. They got divorced, and my mom met Don the next summer. The gentleman that I call my dad, Don Scott, adopted me in 1981. And I always felt like he dearly loved me. Dad never made me feel any different from the rest of the Scott family.
Don marries Sean's mother, and 8 years later, Sean's half-brother Daniel is born.
When I was very little, Sean and I were very close. He was my childhood hero. Sean was this rock star. Everyone knew who he was, everyone liked him, everyone was always wanting to talk to him. He was on the football team. That was the #1 football team in the state for many years. I wanted to do nothing more than to be Sean.
As he nears his junior year, Sean starts thinking about his future. He has huge aspirations for college, but his mom is an artist, and his stepdad is retired from the Navy.
And both my mom and dad sat me down and said, look, son, we're concerned that if you're going to go to college, you're going to have to figure out how to finance it yourself because we don't have the means to help you. So I started looking for all the schools that had cheap tuition, and then I landed on the United States Military Academy at West Point, and tuition per semester was $0. I'm like, wow, that's going to be easy to afford.
But West Point is the most prestigious military academy in the country and extremely difficult to get into.
So I spent a lot of time from 10th grade on in the guidance counselor's office. That's how I came into Trish Ellis's circle of awareness.
Trish Ellis, a bookkeeper at the school inside the guidance department, is the wife of a prominent pharmacist in town and the mother of Wendy Ellis.
Wendy was very outgoing and friendly, smiling all the time. She was a cheerleader.
I do remember Trish Ellis, Wendy's mother, being very, very much supportive of Sean. I believe that she saw that that would be very promising for her daughter.
Trish stops me one day and says, hey, Sean, Wendy is struggling in algebra. Do you mind tutoring her? And we'll be happy to pay you. I'm like, I'll do that for free. I'll pay you to do that. Wendy pretended to be struggling to learn and not be able to understand. She would bat her eyes at me, which really excited me. I was just mesmerized by the radiant blue eyes that she had. I really enjoyed the interaction with Wendy.
During the last semester of his senior year, Sean notices that Wendy is absent from school.
I passed Trish's office and I said, "Hey, Trish, I haven't seen Wendy in school in like 2 weeks. Is she all right?" And she says, "Oh, well, it's pretty sad, but she's in the hospital down near Atlanta for a eating disorder, bulimia and anorexia."
Sean decides to show support for Wendy and visits her.
When I came in, she looked pitiful. When she saw me, she just lit up. Her eyes got wide. She said, "Sean, you came to see me." And that just got me right there. It's probably the initial seed that made me ask her to go with me to our senior prom.
Sean is delighted when Wendy recovers and agrees to go to the prom with him.
The night before my prom, I got home and there was all this paperwork laid out. There's a set of orders with my name on it, and there's instructions to coordinate travel to West Point. I was so relieved. The next afternoon, I picked up Wendy. We took pictures, and then we were off to dinner and then to the high school gymnasium.
The news of Sean's acceptance into West Point spreads throughout the dance.
Herb and Trish Ellis were chaperones, and they looked like they were overjoyed. Wendy said, "Oh, everyone is so proud of you, and I love you so much." You know, that night, I probably said I love you so that she would kiss me again.
Sean and Wendy grow closer, but once he's at West Point for his freshman year, Sean's schedule is regimented from sunup to sundown.
We were busy. Every time we went to the payphones for the privilege of a very brief phone call, my number one priority was to call Wendy. My second priority was to call my parents.
Wendy tells Sean she is still struggling with her eating disorder, but being in New York makes it hard for him to help her back home in Georgia.
When I was home on leave, Wendy asked me if I would go to one of her psych appointments. I was wholly and consciously aware that Wendy had long-term mental health challenges.
I believe that the protective nature of Sean would draw him to try to help someone like her. She's beautiful, she's well known, the family's well known. She has a problem, so naturally a protective person like that would want to try to shelter that person and help fix them.
At West Point, the years in the calendar seem to fly by, but every day seems like it's an eternity. So in order to help make the experience tolerable, there are a series of milestone events that include a speech, a ball, a dinner, and one of those is called 500th Night.
The event takes place during Sean's junior year, and Wendy's parents drive her from Georgia to New York to celebrate.
They allowed Wendy and I to have some private time alone. Wendy and I enjoyed a wonderful night, and I was really excited and proud to show off my girlfriend from my hometown. It was just like a night of joy and excitement.
With only one more year till Sean's graduation, the future looks bright if they can get a handle on Wendy's health issues.
One day, we were out shopping together, and she just fainted right there in the store. She refused to have an ambulance called. She said that she had diabetes. I had no clue she had diabetes.
Wendy Scott is a very manipulative woman, and she's very dangerous.
She craved attention and affection from others, and she went to any length to get that.
Now I don't know what to believe.
Sean Scott is at West Point when he finds out that his girlfriend Wendy has another serious health complaint.
When I found out that Wendy had diabetes, I was very concerned for her health. She told me that the insulin that she had, she did not get from a doctor. Her father got it from his pharmacy that he worked at and gave it to her. Only once did I actually see her inject herself with insulin. I loved her, and I wanted to be a support to her and to help her in any way that I can.
Sean seemed happy with Wendy, but there was always something about her that made me feel uncomfortable. There was just always that little feeling in me that just made me feel unsure about her.
By Sean's third year at West Point, his relationship with Wendy has evolved. However, he suffers a devastating loss in his family in April 1996 when his stepdad becomes seriously ill.
I made it home on emergency leave from West Point just in time.
I remember Sean opening the door to the ICU in his uniform from West Point and running through the ICU to my father's side. And then I was taken out of the room, but I remember looking back and seeing Sean sitting there holding his hand.
I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. And I held on to it until I felt the warmth leave.
The next year, Sean's stepdad's absence is felt at his graduation from West Point. But Sean is able to celebrate with Wendy and family.
My mom, my brother, Herb, Trish, Wendy's grandparents came and attended. I was full of pride and exuberance. I had people in my hometown that were there. I was going to get to shake hands with the President of the United States. It was just a great day all around.
A few days later, Sean and Wendy drive from New York to Georgia to elope without family present.
Wendy and I got married in a tiny little chapel on June 3rd, 1997. My best friend Joe was my best man, and he brought along his wife. Wendy was over the top. She acted as if she was about to faint. She did not focus on me. She had a hard time getting through her vows. So that part was kind of bizarre. We had made plans for a honeymoon, and we drove straight through the night to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Wendy was not interested in any physical intimacy, and she said that she was feeling physically ill, and that was a great disappointment. But to me, that was not as important as abiding by my vow to love, cherish, and care for her in sickness and in health. I was okay with that because there are higher priorities than my own carnal satisfaction.
A year later, in 1998, after taking the U.S. Army Engineer Officers Course, Wendy and Sean moved to Columbia, Georgia, just a few hours from home.
My first permanent duty station in the Army was Fort Benning in Georgia. And we went and did fun things by ourselves and with other people, my West Point classmates included.
Later that year, Hurricane Mitch devastates Central America, and Sean is deployed as part of the Army Corps of Engineers. When Sean returns to Fort Benning, he finds Wendy in a health crisis.
Wendy had gotten a referral to an oncologist because there were some irregularities in her blood work. She told me, "Oh my God, Sean, what if I have cancer?" And then the oncologist broke the news to me that he felt, in his professional opinion, Wendy had leukemia. I couldn't believe it. It was just another shock. I never shaved my own head, but I helped her shave hers. I rarely cried. I definitely cried tears that dripped on her head while I was helping her shave it. She was so grateful, and we had intimate contact that we hadn't had in months or maybe even in years at that point.
Wendy tells Sean that she wants to do the treatments on her own, so as not to distract him from his work.
She said, "I've found a specialist that can treat me right here at the hospital. You can just drop me off in the morning, and then I'll find a ride home." While she was going to chemotherapy, there was less strange behavior, and all the other antics faded away.
Wendy starts her treatment, and Sean believes that all is going well, until one day, he is summoned to a meeting with some other Army spouses at Fort Benning.
It was a historic home of a colonel, and Wendy was sitting there, and she looked up at me, had a very nervous look on her face, and was very fidgety. You could hear a pin drop. One of the spouses said, "We have discovered that Wendy does not really have cancer. She's been lying to us, and we've all been deeply hurt by this." I couldn't say anything. I was filled with rage.
Second Lieutenant Sean Scott has been told by a group of Army spouses that his wife Wendy is faking having cancer.
I was just devastated, embarrassed. I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't say anything except, "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I am so sorry that this happened." I learned that one of the church community saw her at the hospital. She just walked around like a normal person, and she wasn't behaving like she would behave at church, where she would present as if she was deathly ill and unable to perform activities of daily living on her own and needed help.
But how did Wendy trick her oncologist into a leukemia diagnosis?
I was finally coming to grips with an escalating pattern of behavior. I believe Wendy figured out how to manipulate her body so that her blood work came back such that more than one medical provider was convinced that she had leukemia.
He had worked very hard to get to where he was, and he had a very promising career ahead of him. The situation that she put them in could very much damage his entire career.
I was committed to her because I considered marriage my bond with Wendy and with God. And I wasn't going to give up on that, and I was determined not to get a divorce. I decided that I was going to monitor and control her behavior as best I could.
For the next 2 years, Sean focuses on the demands of his career and spends less and less time with Wendy. In April of 2002, he is notified that Wendy is in the ER because of a complication related to her diabetes.
The physician on call was present. After the whole cancer thing, I knew from then on that she was faking. She found some new docs who didn't know her backstory. I said, look, doc, I respect what you do, and I just want you to know that I know without a shadow of a doubt that my wife does not have diabetes. Never has. He paused, looked at me in the eyes for a second and said, okay, would you like for me to put her on a 72-hour hold? I came in and told her she was going to a psych ward, and she was livid. She was throwing objects at me. She was yelling at me.
And Wendy has one more bomb to drop.
A nurse came in and said, we got your blood results. Wendy was pregnant.
On December 13th, 2002, Sean and Wendy's daughter is born with hydrocephalus, a condition that will require multiple surgeries.
When our daughter was born, Wendy's behaviors regarding her own health just disappeared. It was like magic. I found out that I was deploying. I was amped and energized and excited to exercise my leadership in the role of company commander.
Sean is deployed to Kuwait, but gets emergency medical leave to return to the U.S. in March 2004.
I was back in the States in Chapel Hill, North Carolina for the first of a series of brain surgeries for our daughter at a UNC medical center. My personal belief is that the hydrocephalus condition, which was diagnosed as Chiari malformation, was congenital. In 2004, my daughter began developing symptoms from vomiting to abnormal eating behavior to constant diarrhea.
Sean is now stationed at Fort Detrick, Maryland, so that the family can be close to Walter Reed Medical Center, where their daughter is a frequent visitor.
The doctors were unsure as to what exactly was wrong. They were pursuing the option of leukemia, and they were doing everything that they could to help her.
Over the next 3 years, Sean and Wendy pull closer together. Wendy is no longer faking health issues and gives birth to a son who is underweight but otherwise healthy. At Walter Reed, the doctors cannot determine the cause of Sean's daughter's ongoing symptoms.
My daughter underwent hundreds of diagnostic procedures. The spinal tap, that's an extremely painful procedure, and it was gut-wrenching, heartbreaking to be present and in the room with her.
In June of 2007, Sean gets a call from Wendy.
There's going to be a multidisciplinary team meeting. So all the specialists, along with the primary care manager, meet in a room with the parents, and one of the lead GI physicians laid a bombshell. There are levels of magnesium in your daughter's system that I cannot account for. So that tells me that either you pointing at me or you pointing at Wendy or both of you have been giving your daughter magnesium of some form. And Wendy confessed on the spot. I did it, and I looked at her in front of all these people. All I could say was, how could you?
The place that you have to be mentally to do something like that to an innocent little child, you would have to be evil.
Sean Scott's 4-year-old daughter has undergone dozens of medical procedures for various health issues since her birth. His wife, Wendy, has now admitted to poisoning her. The state takes custody of the Scott children.
Anger doesn't even come close. It's more like rage. I was shocked, stunned, sickened, saddened. I drove Wendy home, and she cried, and she blabbered on to me about how we still have to stick together as a family. And I just looked at her, and I was like, will you shut the up? Or I was going to wreck the car and kill both of us.
In June 2007, I received a call from Fort Detrick advising me that they had just received a call from Walter Reed, and they believed they had a child abuse case. They advised that the mother of the child had been confronted by the doctor and actually admitted that she had been poisoning her child and that she was withdrawing blood from the child as well. I knew about Munchausen by proxy, what they call it today, fictitious disorder by proxy. And immediately it triggered into my mind that I may have one of those cases. In a Munchausen by proxy case, the person themselves is Munchausen. And they cause their own illnesses or injuries to gain attention. And normally it's when they can't get attention for themselves anymore that they move on to a child.
Agent Smith calls FBI headquarters to talk to a profiler.
I knew that I was going to have to approach this interview differently. The behavioral analysis profiler told me to make the interview completely about her, to not talk about her children and the things that she did to the child, but to talk about how it affected her and how it made her feel. Just focus the entire interview on Wendy. I walked in, the chaplain was there, and Wendy Scott was there. You're expecting a monster, but in fact, she actually looks like a little child herself. She comes across very innocent, very naive, someone that you want to protect. Wendy showed absolutely no remorse during the interview. I realized that I did in fact have a Munchausen by proxy case, that she was truly injuring her child to gain attention for herself. And so my goal at that point was to get as much evidence as I could. I was able to get consent from Wendy to search the house. The home that the Scotts lived in was in a very nice area. The house was very organized and clean. Similarly, so was the victim child's bedroom. It was a beautiful bedroom. It looked like she cared very deeply for this child by the way that the room was presented. I spoke to the team leader of our evidence response team that went directly to the kitchen trash can. And sure enough, on the top of the trash can was a large bottle of milk and magnesia. And I saw a red hazmat box, the type you find in a doctor's office where you put expended syringes in. And inside were 5 syringes with blood in them. I actually took the photo books to see if they told any type of story. I was able to see things such as the child had straight hair. And I saw that Wendy had taken pictures of this victim child when she was putting curlers in her hair. I later interviewed the doctors at Walter Reed. They all described her as looking like Shirley Temple, who had curly hair. She wanted her daughter to look adorable and all the doctors to fall in love with her, to be the cutest kid on the floor, if you will. Wendy would do the child's hair in advance the night before. And then she would do something to the child to induce the symptoms that resulted in her bringing the child to the hospital. So it showed premeditation. I did learn through my investigation that Wendy herself had feigned illness at a previous base. She claimed she had leukemia, she was in a wheelchair, she'd shaved her head, she even shaved her eyebrows, literally had everyone absolutely convinced that she had it. She figured out a way to cause those type of symptoms in herself, and she was trying to do the same thing to her daughter.
Sean must now prove he is a fit parent to regain custody of his children.
I had a court date immediately. had to hire my own attorney.
It was really devastating to him. But he picked himself up and began to make sure the children had a stable, safe place to be.
The evidence, timing, and Sean's record of conduct eventually exonerate him from suspicion.
Sean Scott had been serving his country, only to find that the enemy was not abroad. The enemy was in his own household, nearly killing his child. When the victim and the younger sibling were in Sean Scott's custody, they immediately started improving. The symptoms that the child presented with at Walter Reed Medical Center never, ever recurred.
After convincing a judge that I was a fit parent, I got legal custody of my children.
The case goes from FBI jurisdiction during the investigation to Maryland state prosecutors as they prepare for an indictment.
Agent Smith reviewed with me the information she received from Dr. Delormier, the attending physician at Walter Reed Medical Center. This woman was causing her child a near-death medical condition. The symptoms progressed to dramatic blood loss to the point where on 3 different occasions that the child had to be transfused. Dr. Delormier testified that the child could very well have died with the amount of blood that was taken from her system. It was dangerous enough that as a prosecutor, I had to make sure that she never had contact with that child again, with her younger child, or with any child. That was my focus.
On November 16, 2007, Wendy Scott is indicted on 15 charges.
She was charged with at least 2 counts of first-degree child abuse, second-degree child abuse, first-degree assault, second-degree assault, and reckless endangerment.
On March 13, 2008, Wendy Scott pleads guilty to first-degree child abuse.
In exchange for dismissing the remaining counts, the defense agreed that at sentencing, the parties would be free to argue as to what the appropriate sentence would be.
Wendy's sentencing hearing takes place 2 months later.
When she first came into court, she was just fluttering around, smiling, talking to people. It was clear she wanted to be the center of attention. But she did not testify during the sentencing hearing. The state presented testimony principally from Dr. Delormier. He was so incensed by this whole incident and what that child had suffered. Because of the blood loss levels, the myriad of tests that she had to undergo, the radiology she was subjected to, his testimony went to the permanency of the injury to that young victim. The defense, they were arguing that she didn't intend to hurt the child. The only reason she was doing it was because of her own mental disorder. She'd been diagnosed with a borderline personality disorder. One of the manifestations of that was the fictitious disorder and fictitious disorder by proxy. But she knew that the blood she was withdrawing was causing the child to be transfused at least 3 times. And for her to say that she didn't know that what she was doing was causing harm is just not defensible.
Concerned that Wendy will present a further risk to her daughter if she gets a light sentence, the prosecution presents surprising evidence that her disorder is deeply rooted. Even while on bail, Wendy had been exhibiting classic fictitious disorder behaviors.
She decided to get a job, and while she was there, I discovered that she was faking cancer and diabetes. She would go on her lunch break and sit in her car on a 90-plus degree day, and then passing out, and that the ambulance would be called. She submits a request to this employer requesting time off, saying that she had lymphoma and that she needed to go for chemo on a weekly basis.
She was engaging in this very type of behavior, even at a time where she was participating in counseling and under the supervision of a psychiatric professional. She was doing this again.
This revelation seals Wendy's fate with the judge.
The judge sentenced her to 15 years of active incarceration and 5 years of supervised probation.
I had finally come to the realization that she was never going to stop doing this.
Sean takes off his wedding ring, files for divorce, and visits Wendy in jail one last time.
Within a couple of seconds of visiting her, and she looked down and she held my hand and she said, "Why did you take off your ring? Someone will fall in love with you. You can't do that." So I was just like, "I'm sorry." And she's like, "I think you need to go."
After 11 years of trauma, Sean is free to find love with a new partner and discovers there is light at the end of the tunnel.
My brother and Sean worked together at Walter Reed. We were both going through divorces about the same time, and we were friends. I wanted to help Sean primarily because I knew what a wonderful man he was. As a mother, it's an overwhelming story to hear. It still hurts to this day. Yeah, I felt terrible for him because it was a lot. And as a mom, like, our kids are close in age, so it really hit home. Our friendship grew more and more. Once his divorce was final, it was like an instant connection. Sean's children needed a lot of healing and love and support due to the damage that was caused by Wendy Scott.
In 2010, Sean and Rachel marry and blend their families. Rachel becomes the loving and protective mother Sean's kids have never known.
While Sean was deployed to Afghanistan, Wendy submitted a request for reconsideration. She wanted to reduce her prison time, and we feel that she coordinated that request in knowing that Sean was in Afghanistan, and so they attended that request. It was probably the most terrifying day of my life because I really didn't want to see Wendy in person. But I was also proud to speak on the kid's behalf because he was obviously not able to be there.
For the first time since her arrest, Wendy takes the stand.
You start by telling him your name.
Wendy Michelle Scott.
You have any children?
Yes, I do.
She obviously presented a very positive picture of her accomplishments.
Do you currently believe you're a danger to the community?
No, I am not.
Not one mention was made about the child. She knew that her counseling would not be successful if she was not able to be honest. So I asked her, "Tell me what you did to your daughter."
Ms. Scott, could you tell us, please, what you did to...
And she was very taken aback by that. The defense, of course, objected to it, and the judge wanted to hear the answer, too. She hemmed and she hawed.
Miss Angel, I am not a doctor. I cannot honestly, under oath, say that I know exactly what I did to her. I don't know.
And I don't think she ever really did answer my question. I just said, I have nothing more. I don't have any more questions.
And then I read a victim impact statement. She works hard every single day of her life to try to be a typical kid. She will be scarred forever. It is something that we will deal with for the rest of her life. And part of that was I had said that his daughter had her feeding tube removed. And as I was saying that, there was a cheer from Wendy, like, yay! Thank goodness I had the DA and the FBI agent on both sides of me because I think I would have done something mean. She did this to her daughter, and I'm the one that, along with Sean, we got rid of it and reached that milestone together. The damage and the harm that she did to an innocent little girl is just baffling. I think it's evil.
Ms. Scott, that sentence I imposed then was appropriate, and it remains appropriate. You nearly killed her, and your motion to modify is denied.
Wendy loses the appeal for a shortened sentence and serves her full term.
Sean and the kids are in a much better place. We all had to do the hard work together as a family. One of my proudest moments was to be by his side when he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, because his career was almost destroyed because of Wendy. All 4 kids were at the ceremony, and of course, I cried. But it was just a very special day.
Sean is a proud and intensely private man, but he tells his story to warn others.
I'm at peace with it now. I'm okay. I cherish and appreciate the love and support that my wife and my children and my extended family and all my friends have given me to be able to get to the point. My purpose and mission will be to help somebody out there who's doubting themselves. Take action, don't hesitate, seek help. If you got doubts or questions, talk to somebody.
Sean is joyful in his new life and has high hopes for the future of his children.
They're strong, resilient children. I'm very proud of them. They're going to go on to do great things in their own right out there.
It began, as so many tragedies do, with a man who believed he was fighting the enemy somewhere far away. Sean Scott had trained his entire adult life to face danger head-on. He had marched across muddy fields before sunrise, memorized commands until they became instinct, and learned to lead men under pressure so intense it could crush lesser souls. He had earned honors that most soldiers would spend a lifetime chasing, medals that reflected discipline, courage, and unwavering commitment. In his world, threats were supposed to be visible, defined, external. You identified them, confronted them, and neutralized them. But no one had prepared him for the kind of enemy that smiled at him across the dinner table. On a quiet day in June 2007, Sean walked into a sterile conference room at Walter Reed Medical Center, expecting another routine discussion about his daughter's worsening condition. The air inside the room felt heavy, as if it had been holding its breath long before he arrived. Doctors lined one side of the table, their expressions carefully controlled, professional, but not neutral. There was something else there, something unresolved, something waiting. His wife, Wendy, was already seated. She didn't look at him right away. Instead, her fingers twitched in her lap, restless, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. When she finally lifted her gaze, her eyes, those same striking blue eyes that had once captivated him as a teenager, seemed to flicker with something unfamiliar. Not fear, not guilt, something closer to anticipation. Sean felt it immediately. A shift. The kind you only recognize when it's already too late. A doctor cleared his throat. Papers were adjusted. Someone folded their hands together, then unfolded them again. Small movements, but they echoed loudly in the silence. Then came the words that would fracture Sean's world beyond repair. There were substances in his daughter's body. Levels that couldn't be explained. Not by illness. Not by accident. Magnesium. Too much of it. The kind of excess that didn't just happen. The kind that had to be given. Deliberately. The doctor's voice was steady, clinical, but the meaning behind it struck like a hammer. He didn't accuse outright. Not yet. Instead, he did something far worse. He pointed. First at Sean. Then at Wendy. Then, without saying it directly, at the possibility that both of them, her parents, could be responsible. Sean felt the room tilt. For a brief, disorienting second, he couldn't even process the accusation. His mind rejected it outright, searching for a more reasonable explanation, something that fit the rules of the world he understood. There had to be a mistake, a lab error, a misreading. But before he could speak, before he could even form the words to defend himself, Wendy inhaled sharply. And then she said it. I did it. 3 words. Soft. Simple. Unmistakable. The kind of confession that doesn't explode, it sinks. It settles into the room like a dense fog, suffocating everything in its path. Sean turned to look at her. Really look at her. He searched her face for something, anything, that might explain what he had just heard. Regret. Panic. A crack in the carefully maintained image he had trusted for so many years. But what he saw instead was something far more disturbing. Relief. As if a burden had finally been lifted. As if this moment, this exact moment, had been building inside her all along. The silence that followed was unbearable. No one moved. No one spoke. The doctors, trained to handle the worst of human suffering, seemed frozen in place, caught between professional duty and raw disbelief. Sean's heartbeat thundered in his ears. His thoughts fractured into pieces that refused to come together. His daughter, his little girl, fragile, sick, enduring procedure after procedure, crying in hospital rooms under fluorescent lights, all of it rushed back in a flood. The spinal taps, the transfusions, the nights he had stood beside her bed, gripping the rails, praying silently because there was nothing else he could do. Every moment he had believed they were fighting an invisible illness. Every moment he had trusted the person standing beside him. And now, how could you, he finally said. The words came out hoarse, almost unrecognizable, as if they belonged to someone else. They weren't shouted. They weren't dramatic. They were hollow, stripped of everything except disbelief. Wendy didn't answer. Or maybe she couldn't. Or maybe she simply didn't feel the need to. Because for her, the truth had already been spoken. For Sean, it had just begun to unravel. In that instant, the past rewrote itself. Every strange illness Wendy had ever claimed, every hospital visit, every diagnosis that had never quite made sense, every moment he had dismissed his own doubts in favor of loyalty, of love, of faith. They all came rushing back, no longer isolated incidents, but pieces of a pattern he had refused to see. And the most horrifying realization of all began to take shape. This wasn't new. This wasn't sudden. This had been happening for years. Slowly, carefully, right in front of him. The room began to close in, the air thick and suffocating. Sean felt something rising inside him. Not just anger, but something deeper. Something primal. The kind of rage that doesn't shout, doesn't lash out, but simmers beneath the surface, threatening to consume everything in its path. He stood there, a decorated soldier who had faced pressure, chaos, and uncertainty in ways most people could never imagine, and yet he had never felt more powerless. Because this wasn't a battlefield, he understood. There were no clear lines, no commands to follow, no enemy to confront in the traditional sense. The enemy was sitting right there. The woman he had loved since high school. The woman he had married. The mother of his children. And suddenly, nothing about her made sense anymore. The doctors began to speak again, their voices distant, as if coming from another room. Protocols. Procedures. Authorities that needed to be notified. Words that should have mattered, but couldn't compete with the storm inside Sean's mind. He barely heard them. All he could see was his daughter. Her small body, weakened by something that was never a disease. Her suffering, carefully manufactured. Her pain, inflicted not by chance, but by design. A design that had been carried out by the person who was supposed to protect her. Sean's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Not in preparation for action, but in a desperate attempt to hold himself together. Because if he let go, if he allowed even a fraction of what he was feeling to surface, he wasn't sure what would happen next. And that terrified him more than anything. Because for the first time in his life, Sean Scott didn't trust himself. Not in that moment. Not in that room. Not with the truth he had just been forced to face. He turned away from Wendy, unable to look at her any longer. The woman he thought he knew was gone. In her place was someone else entirely. Someone capable of something he could barely comprehend. Something so calculated, so deliberate, that it defied every belief he had ever held about love, family, and trust. As he walked out of that room, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the realization was physically pressing down on him. The hallway outside was bright, almost painfully so, the fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows that seemed too real, too defined. People passed by, unaware. Doctors, nurses, families. Life continued as it always does. But for Sean, everything had changed. Because the war he thought he was fighting, the one he had trained for, the one he understood, was nothing compared to the one that had been unfolding inside his own home. And the most chilling part? It had been happening all along. Quietly, patiently, hidden behind a smile, hidden behind those striking blue eyes. Eyes he had once trusted without question. Eyes that had watched him love, protect, and believe, while something far darker was taking shape beneath the surface. Sean stepped outside, the air hitting his face like a shock, but it did nothing to steady him. Because there was no steadying this. No simple explanation. No quick resolution. Only one undeniable truth, echoing louder with every passing second. The enemy was never out there. The enemy had been right beside him all along. Long before hospital rooms and whispered accusations, before sterile corridors and the quiet horror of realization, there was a small town where everything felt predictable, almost comforting in its simplicity. Nestled in the gentle folds of northern Georgia, Tico was the kind of place where people didn't just know each other's names. They knew their histories, their families, their habits, and sometimes even their secrets. It was a place where routines rarely changed, where Sunday mornings meant church pews filled with familiar faces, and where high school football games weren't just events but rituals that defined the rhythm of the community. Sean Scott grew up in that world, shaped by it in ways that would follow him for the rest of his life. His childhood wasn't perfect, but it was grounded in something steady, something he could rely on. His mother had been young when she had him, and like many stories that begin with hope and uncertainty intertwined, her early marriage didn't last. But the instability that might have fractured another family was quietly repaired when a man named Don stepped in, not just as a husband, but as a father in every sense that mattered. Don Scott didn't treat Sean like a stepchild. There was no distance, no hesitation in the way he loved him. To Sean, there was never a question of belonging. He was a Scott, fully and completely, and that sense of identity anchored him. It gave him something solid to stand on as he grew older, something that would later fuel his determination to succeed. By the time Sean reached middle school and then high school, he had already become something of a local legend. Not in the exaggerated way small towns sometimes elevate their own, but in a way that felt earned. He was charismatic without trying too hard, confident without arrogance. People gravitated toward him naturally. On the football field, he moved with precision and strength, part of a team that dominated the state year after year. In the hallways, he carried himself with an ease that made others want to be around him, to talk to him, to be like him. For his younger brother Daniel, Sean wasn't just an older sibling. He was a hero. The kind of figure you look up to when you're still trying to figure out who you are, someone who seems to have already solved the puzzle. Daniel watched everything Sean did, absorbing it, admiring it, measuring himself against it in ways only younger siblings truly understand. But beneath the surface of that admiration and small-town admiration, Sean was already thinking ahead. He wasn't content to stay where he was, not because he didn't love his hometown, but because he could feel something larger calling him. The problem was, ambition doesn't pay tuition. His parents were honest with him, in the way that only parents who truly care can be. They sat him down and explained that if he wanted to go to college, he would have to find a way to make it happen on his own. There was no hidden savings account, no financial safety net waiting to catch him. It wasn't a rejection of his dreams, it was a reality check. And Sean responded the only way he knew how. He started searching. Every option. Every possibility. He combed through information, looking for a path that would allow him to move forward without placing an impossible burden on his family. That search eventually led him to something that seemed almost too good to be true: United States Military Academy. West Point wasn't just a school. It was a proving ground, a place where only the most disciplined, the most determined, the most capable could survive, let alone graduate. The acceptance rate alone was enough to discourage most applicants, but for Sean, it represented something else entirely. Opportunity. The tuition was covered, the education was elite, and the path forward was clear if he was willing to fight for it. From that moment on, his focus sharpened. He spent hours in the guidance counselor's office, navigating the complex application process, gathering recommendations, refining every detail that might give him an edge. It was during those long hours, in that quiet corner of the school, that his life intersected with someone who would change everything. Her name was Wendy Ellis. She wasn't hard to notice. In a school where familiarity bred a kind of comfortable invisibility, Wendy stood out effortlessly. She was vibrant, outgoing, the kind of person who seemed to carry her own light into every room she entered. Her smile came easily, her laughter even more so, and when she looked at someone, it felt like she was truly seeing them. But it was her eyes that people remembered most. A striking shade of blue, bright and expressive, capable of shifting from playful to vulnerable in an instant. They drew people in, held their attention, made them feel something, even if they couldn't quite explain what that something was. Sean noticed her. Of course he did. But their connection didn't begin with some grand, cinematic moment. It started quietly, almost incidentally, through Wendy's mother, Trish Ellis. Trish worked at the school, deeply involved in the guidance department where Sean spent so much of his time. She had watched him from a distance, observed his discipline, his ambition, the way he carried himself. And she saw potential, not just for him, but for her daughter. One day, she approached Sean with a simple request. Wendy, she explained, was struggling with algebra. Would he be willing to tutor her? They were prepared to pay him for his time. Sean didn't hesitate. He agreed immediately, brushing off the idea of payment as if it didn't matter. But something did matter. From the very first session, there was a shift. Wendy didn't approach the tutoring like a student desperate to understand equations. Instead, she brought a kind of playful uncertainty to it, a deliberate softness that blurred the line between genuine confusion and something more intentional. She would tilt her head slightly, let her eyes linger just a moment longer than necessary, offer a smile that felt both innocent and calculated. And Sean, for all his discipline, for all his focus, found himself drawn in. He told himself it was harmless. He told himself it was just part of helping her. But the truth was more complicated. Because somewhere in those sessions, between the numbers and the quiet conversations, something began to grow. Something neither of them fully understood yet. To the outside world, it looked like a typical high school connection. A popular football player and a cheerful cheerleader, their paths crossing in a way that felt almost inevitable. But beneath that surface, there were currents already forming, subtle, almost imperceptible, but powerful in ways that would only become clear much later. Wendy wasn't just charming. She was observant. She watched Sean carefully, learning his rhythms, his strengths, his sense of responsibility. She saw the part of him that wanted to protect, to help, to fix things when they were broken. And whether consciously or not, she began to lean into that. At first, it was small. A little more vulnerability here. A slightly exaggerated confusion there. Moments that invited him to step in, to guide, to support. And Sean did what came naturally to him. He stepped forward. Because that's who he was. Because that's who he had always been. In a town like Tico, where life felt simple and predictable, where people believed they understood each other, the foundation of something far more complex was quietly being laid. A relationship built not just on attraction or affection, but on something deeper and far more dangerous. Trust. And neither of them could have known then just how much that trust would one day cost. If you had asked anyone in Tico to describe Wendy Ellis back then, they would have painted a picture that felt almost too perfect to question. She was the girl people noticed without trying to. The kind of presence that didn't demand attention, yet somehow always received it. In a hallway full of familiar faces, she stood out not because she was louder or more dominant, but because she seemed effortlessly radiant, as if she carried a quiet spotlight with her wherever she went. She smiled often. That was the first thing people remembered. Not just polite smiles, but bright, open expressions that made others feel included, seen, even special for a fleeting moment. It was disarming. Teachers found her pleasant. Classmates found her easy to talk to. Adults in the community described her as sweet, well-mannered, the kind of young woman who came from a good family. And in a town like that, a good family meant something. Her mother, Trish Ellis, was deeply embedded in the school system, working within the guidance department where she had access not only to academic records, but to the quiet currents that moved beneath the surface of student life. Her father was a respected pharmacist, someone people trusted with their health, someone whose reputation carried weight. Together, they formed a family that appeared stable, respectable, even aspirational. Wendy was their daughter, and she knew exactly how to live within that image. She was a cheerleader, which in that environment wasn't just an extracurricular activity, it was a role, a symbol. It meant she was visible, admired, part of the social fabric that defined high school life. Friday nights under stadium lights, the echo of cheers, the synchronized movements on the sidelines. She belonged in that world, and she played her part well. But there were moments, small, almost unnoticeable cracks, that hinted at something more complicated beneath the surface. They didn't appear all at once. They never do. Instead, they slipped in quietly, often disguised as vulnerability. Wendy had a way of shifting depending on who she was with. With her friends, she was lively, animated, quick to laugh. With adults, she could be polite, soft-spoken, almost delicate. And with Sean, she became something else entirely, someone who seemed to need him. It started subtly during those tutoring sessions. She would hesitate before answering a question, even when the solution was simple. Her brow would furrow just enough to suggest confusion, her voice softening as she asked for help. And when Sean explained something, when he leaned in to guide her through the steps, she responded not just with understanding, but with admiration. "You're so smart," she might say, her eyes lifting to meet his. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, the way her gaze lingered, the way her tone carried a quiet dependency, as if his presence made things easier, safer, more manageable. For someone like Sean, disciplined, responsible, driven to lead and protect, it was almost impossible not to respond to that. But Wendy's world wasn't always as effortless as it appeared. There were whispers, though they never grew loud enough to form clear conclusions. Classmates occasionally noticed that she seemed tired, more than what would be expected from a typical high school schedule. There were days when she was absent, explanations offered casually, accepted without much question. In a small town, people noticed patterns, but they were also quick to trust familiar narratives. "She's just not feeling well. She's been under a lot of stress. She's having some health issues." The phrases circulated, never fully examined, never challenged. Because why would they be? Wendy didn't fit the profile of someone hiding something dark. She was too bright, too likable, too normal. But then came the moment that shifted everything, at least for Sean. It was during the final stretch of their senior year, a time when most students were focused on graduation, on the future, on the fragile excitement of stepping into adulthood. Sean, already deep in the process of securing his place at United States Military Academy, was balancing anticipation with pressure, his path forward demanding everything he had. And Wendy disappeared. Not completely. Not dramatically. Just absent. A day turned into several. Several turned into weeks. At first, it was easy to assume she was dealing with something minor. A lingering illness, perhaps. A family matter. But as time stretched on, the absence became harder to ignore. Sean felt it more than most. By then, their connection had deepened. What had started as tutoring had evolved into something more intimate, more emotionally charged. He found himself thinking about her, wondering where she was, why she hadn't reached out. So he did what felt natural. He went looking for answers. Passing by the guidance office one day, he stopped to speak with Trish. It wasn't a formal conversation, just a quick question, but the response he received carried a weight he hadn't expected. Wendy was in the hospital. The words landed heavily, but it was the explanation that followed that truly unsettled him. An eating disorder, bulimia, anorexia, the kind of diagnosis that didn't just affect the body but the mind, the identity, the very way a person saw themselves. It was serious, potentially life-threatening. And suddenly, all those small, unexamined moments, the fatigue, the absences, the subtle shifts in her behavior, seemed to align into something more coherent, more concerning. For Sean, the reaction was immediate. He didn't hesitate. He didn't overthink it. He went to see her. The hospital room was quiet when he entered, the kind of silence that feels heavy rather than peaceful. Wendy lay in the bed, her appearance altered in a way that was both subtle and striking. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, as if the energy that once defined her had been drained away. For a brief moment, Sean felt something close to shock. This was not the girl he had come to know. This was someone fragile, vulnerable. But then she saw him, and everything changed. Her eyes widened, those same vivid blue eyes lighting up with a sudden intensity that seemed almost out of place in that sterile environment. Her face shifted, the exhaustion giving way to something brighter, something warmer. "Sean, you came to see me." There was something in her voice, relief, gratitude, maybe even a hint of disbelief, that cut through him in a way he hadn't anticipated. In that moment, whatever doubts, whatever questions might have existed, faded into the background. All he saw was someone who needed him, someone who was struggling, someone who, despite everything, found comfort in his presence. And for Sean, that was enough. More than enough. It wasn't just sympathy that took root in that hospital room. It was something deeper, a sense of purpose. Because loving Wendy didn't feel like a passive experience. It felt active. It felt like something that required effort, commitment, sacrifice. And Sean was the kind of person who didn't shy away from those things. If anything, he leaned into them. What he didn't realize, what no one could have fully understood at the time, was how that dynamic would evolve. Because Wendy's vulnerability, whether genuine or not, had a gravitational pull. It drew people closer. It made them invest. And once they were invested, it became much harder to step back, to question, to see things clearly. Sean left that hospital room changed. Not in a dramatic, immediately visible way, but in a quiet, internal shift that would shape every decision he made moving forward. Because from that point on, Wendy wasn't just someone he cared about. She was someone he felt responsible for. And that sense of responsibility would become the thread that bound them together, tightening over time in ways neither of them could fully control. In the eyes of the world, Wendy Ellis remained the same bright, charming girl she had always been. But for Sean, she had become something else entirely. Someone he needed to protect. Someone he believed he could help. Someone he was no longer willing to walk away from. Even as the first shadows began to gather, barely visible, just at the edges of the life they were building together. The night everything was supposed to feel perfect began with something that looked, at first glance, like a dream unfolding exactly as it should. It was late spring in Georgia, the kind of evening where the air carried a soft warmth and the sky stretched out in fading shades of gold and blue. High school was ending, the future was opening, and for Sean Scott, everything he had worked toward was finally becoming real. He had received his orders. A single set of papers laid out on the table the night before prom, bearing his name, confirming his acceptance into United States Military Academy. It wasn't just an achievement. It was validation. Proof that every hour spent studying, every sacrifice, every moment of discipline had led somewhere meaningful. For a young man who had grown up knowing he would have to fight for his future, it felt like the ground beneath him had finally solidified. The next day, dressed in formal wear, standing at the threshold between adolescence and adulthood, Sean went to pick up Wendy. She looked exactly the way everyone expected her to. Beautiful, effortlessly so. Her dress caught the light in a way that made her seem almost luminous, and when she stepped toward him, smiling, there was no trace of the hospital bed, no sign of the fragility he had witnessed just weeks before. If anything, she seemed brighter than ever, as if she had emerged from that period stronger, more vibrant, more alive. They took pictures, posed in front of familiar backdrops, their expressions frozen in moments that would later feel painfully ironic. To anyone looking in from the outside, they were the perfect couple. Young, promising, full of possibility. The night unfolded the way prom nights always do. Dinner, laughter, the hum of conversation filling the spaces between them. Then the gymnasium, transformed into something almost magical, decorated in a way that tried to elevate it beyond its everyday function. Music pulsed through the room, students moving together in loose rhythms, some graceful, some awkward, all of them caught in the fleeting illusion that this moment would last forever. And then the news spread. It didn't happen all at once. It moved through the crowd in waves, whispered from one group to another, growing louder, more defined with each repetition. Sean had been accepted to West Point. Heads turned. Conversations shifted. People approached him, offering congratulations, admiration, curiosity. Teachers smiled with pride. Classmates reacted with a mixture of respect and awe. In a place like this, where paths often stayed close to home, Sean's future felt bigger, almost larger than life. Wendy stayed close to him through it all. At one point, she leaned in, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Everyone is so proud of you," she said. "I love you so much." The words lingered, not just because of what they meant, but because of how they were delivered. There was an intensity there, a depth that felt both genuine and slightly overwhelming, as if the moment demanded more than simple affection. Sean responded the only way he knew how. He said it back. Maybe because he meant it. Maybe because the moment felt right. Maybe because, in that space filled with celebration and expectation, it seemed like the natural thing to do. But something about that exchange, subtle, almost imperceptible, marked a shift. Because from that point on, their relationship wasn't just about connection. It was about commitment. And commitment, once spoken aloud, carries a weight that's hard to undo. In the months that followed, that weight began to grow. Sean left for West Point, stepping into a world that was structured, demanding, relentless. His days were no longer his own. Every hour was accounted for, every action measured against a standard that allowed no room for weakness. It was everything he had worked for, and yet it came with a cost. Distance. The kind that stretches more than just miles. Communication became limited, reduced to brief phone calls from pay phones, moments carved out of an otherwise rigid schedule. And every time Sean had the chance, he chose Wendy first. She remained his priority. But back in Georgia, Wendy's world didn't operate under the same structure. She told him she was still struggling. The eating disorder hadn't simply disappeared. There were appointments, challenges, setbacks. She spoke of them in ways that drew him in, that made him feel both concerned and necessary. Being so far away, unable to see her, unable to help in a tangible way, created a tension inside him that he couldn't resolve. So when he returned home on leave, he tried to bridge that gap. She asked him to attend one of her psychiatric appointments with her. He agreed without hesitation. Sitting there, listening to conversations about her mental health, her struggles, her vulnerabilities, Sean became more than just a boyfriend. He became a witness, a participant, someone who is now directly involved in something complex, something fragile, something that required care and attention. And that role suited him. It aligned with who he was. Protective, responsible, committed. But it also deepened something else. Dependence. Because the more Wendy presented herself as someone who needed support, the more Sean stepped into that role. And the more he stepped into that role, the harder it became to step out of it. Time moved forward. At West Point, milestones came and went, each one marking progress toward a future that seemed increasingly secure. One of those milestones, the 500th night, was meant to celebrate how far the cadets had come a moment of recognition in an otherwise grueling journey. Wendy came to visit. Her parents drove her all the way from Georgia to New York, bringing her into Sean's world for a brief moment. For him, it was an opportunity to show her everything he had been working toward, to integrate the two halves of his life. That night felt different. Lighter. Filled with excitement, pride, a sense that everything was aligning the way it should. They had time alone. Time to reconnect, to enjoy each other's presence without the constraints of distance or obligation. And for Sean, it reinforced something he had already begun to believe. That this relationship, this connection, was worth everything he was putting into it. But beneath that surface, something else was happening. Something quieter, more subtle. Because even in those moments of joy, there were signs. Small ones. Easy to overlook. Easy to dismiss. One day, while they were out shopping together, Wendy collapsed. Just like that. No warning. No clear cause. One moment she was standing, the next she was on the ground. Sean reacted instantly, his training kicking in, his concern immediate and intense. He moved toward her, ready to call for help, ready to do whatever was necessary. But she stopped him, insisted that it wasn't needed, told him she had diabetes. The word hung in the air, unexpected, unexplained. Diabetes. It wasn't something he had heard before. Not from her. Not from anyone else. It introduced a new layer to her identity, a new vulnerability, a new reason for concern. And yet, even in that moment, something didn't quite align. There were no prior conversations about it. No gradual introduction. Just a sudden revelation, delivered in the middle of a crisis. But Sean didn't question it. Not in the way he might have if it had come from someone else. Because this was Wendy. And Wendy, by this point, had become someone he trusted instinctively. Someone whose words carried weight. Someone whose vulnerabilities felt real, even when they didn't fully make sense. He accepted it. Because the alternative, doubt, suspicion, the possibility that something wasn't right, felt harder to face. So instead, he adjusted. He added this new piece to the growing picture of who Wendy was. A young woman. Beautiful.
Charming.
Struggling with an eating disorder. Now dealing with diabetes. Someone who needed care. Someone who needed understanding. Someone who, despite everything, remained at the center of his world. What Sean couldn't see then, what no one around them fully grasped, was how these moments were beginning to form a pattern. A pattern that wasn't random. A pattern that wasn't accidental. But one that was slowly, carefully unfolding. And as it did, the line between truth and illusion began to blur, setting the stage for something far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. By the time the first real cracks began to show, Sean Scott had already built his life around a single, unshakable belief that commitment meant endurance, that love meant staying, even when things became difficult, even when they stopped making sense. It was a belief shaped long before Wendy ever entered his life, forged in the steady, disciplined environment that would eventually lead him to United States Military Academy, where perseverance wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. So, when the inconsistencies began to surface, they didn't register as warnings. They registered as challenges, problems to solve, situations to manage. At first, it was the insulin. Wendy told him she had diabetes, and not just that, she told him she was managing it in a way that immediately raised questions. The insulin she used, she explained, didn't come from a doctor. Her father had access to it through his pharmacy, and he provided it for her directly. It was an explanation that felt unusual, but not impossible. In a small-town context, where trust often replaced formal procedure, it didn't immediately trigger alarm. Sean saw her inject herself once. Just once. The moment stuck with him, not because it confirmed anything, but because it seemed to validate her claim. It was enough to quiet any lingering doubts, to reinforce the narrative she had presented. And because he loved her, because he had committed himself to supporting her, he accepted it. But acceptance didn't bring clarity. If anything, it deepened the confusion. Because Wendy's health issues didn't follow a predictable pattern. They appeared suddenly, intensified quickly, then shifted or disappeared in ways that didn't quite align with what Sean understood about illness. There were moments of apparent crisis, followed by periods where everything seemed almost normal, as if the storm had passed without leaving a trace.
Still, he stayed.
Still, he adjusted. Because walking away was never part of the equation. Time moved forward, carrying them both into the next phase of their lives. Sean progressed through West Point, each year bringing him closer to graduation, to the career he had worked so hard to achieve. Wendy remained a constant presence, even from a distance, their connection sustained through phone calls, visits, and the quiet understanding that they were building something together. But then came another shift, another escalation. And this time, it couldn't be ignored. It happened during his final year, when everything should have been focused on the future, on the transition from cadet to officer, on the life that awaited him beyond the academy. Instead, he found himself confronting something that pulled him sharply back into the present. Wendy got sick again. Not in the vague, undefined way that had characterized her earlier issues, but in a way that came with a specific, terrifying possibility.
Cancer.
It started with irregularities in her blood work, or at least that's how she explained it. Then came the referral to an oncologist, the specialist who would confirm what no one wanted to hear. Wendy's voice, when she spoke about it, carried a mixture of fear and urgency that was impossible to ignore. "What if I have cancer?" she asked him. The question lingered, heavy with implication. And then, according to Wendy, it was answered. Leukemia. The word hit Sean like a physical force. Leukemia wasn't just an illness. It was a life-altering diagnosis, one that brought with it images of hospitals, chemotherapy, uncertainty, and loss. It was serious, potentially fatal, and it reframed everything that had come before it. All the previous health issues, all the unexplained symptoms, they now seemed to lead here, to this moment, as if they had been building towards something that finally made sense. Sean believed her, not because he was naive, but because the alternative required a level of suspicion that felt incompatible with love, with trust, with the commitment he had made. So he responded the way he always did. He stepped closer. He shaved her head. It wasn't something he had ever imagined doing, but in that moment, it felt necessary. A gesture of solidarity, of support, of shared burden. As the hair fell away, revealing the vulnerability beneath, Sean felt something break inside him, something that had been holding steady until that point. He cried. Not openly, not dramatically, but in quiet, uncontrollable tears that slipped down his face and onto her scalp as he continued the task. It was one of the few times in his life where the weight of emotion overcame the discipline he had spent years cultivating. And Wendy responded. With gratitude, with affection, with a closeness that had been absent for some time. For a brief period, everything seemed to align again. Her strange behaviors diminished. The inconsistencies faded into the background. The focus shifted entirely to her treatment, to her recovery, to the process of navigating something as serious as cancer. Wendy told him she had found a specialist who could handle her chemotherapy locally, allowing him to continue his duties without interruption. It was a solution that made sense. Efficient. Practical. Reassuring. Sean dropped her off at the hospital when needed, trusting that she was receiving the care she required, believing that they were moving through this crisis together, even if he couldn't be physically present for every moment. And for a while it worked. Or at least it appeared to. But appearances, as Sean would eventually learn, can be dangerously misleading. The discovery didn't come from him. It came from others. From a group of Army spouses at his duty station, people who had interacted with Wendy, who had observed her behavior, who had begun to notice discrepancies that didn't sit right. They weren't looking for something to be wrong. They weren't trying to uncover a lie. But once the pattern became visible, it was impossible to ignore. They called a meeting. A quiet gathering in a historic home, the kind of setting that suggested seriousness, intention. When Sean arrived, he immediately sensed that something was off. The atmosphere was tense, the usual warmth replaced by something colder, more deliberate. Wendy was already there. Her posture was different. Her energy unsettled. She avoided his eyes at first, her movements restless, her expression tight. And then the truth came out. Not gently, not gradually, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. She didn't have cancer. She had been lying. The words hung in the air, echoing in a silence, so complete it felt unnatural. Sean stood there, absorbing the information, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. It didn't fit. It didn't align with anything he had experienced, anything he had believed. But as the details emerged, as the observations were laid out, as the inconsistencies were connected, something inside him shifted. Because suddenly, the pattern was visible, not as isolated incidents, but as a series of deliberate actions. The hospital visits that didn't match her condition, the behavior that changed depending on the audience, the symptoms that appeared and disappeared without explanation. It all pointed to something he had refused to consider. Something far more disturbing than any illness. Deception. Deep, calculated deception. Sean felt the reaction before he fully understood it. A surge of emotion, intense and overwhelming.
Rage.
Not the kind that explodes outward, but the kind that builds internally, tightening, constricting, demanding release. His chest felt heavy, his stomach twisted, his thoughts raced in directions he couldn't control. But he didn't lash out. He didn't confront her in that moment. Instead, he did something that would define the next phase of his life. He stayed. Even after the truth had been exposed. Even after the illusion had been shattered. Because for Sean, the discovery wasn't a clear endpoint. It was the beginning of something far more complicated. He began to see Wendy differently. Not as someone simply struggling with health issues, but as someone capable of manipulating those issues, of creating them, of using them in ways that blurred the line between vulnerability and control. And yet, he didn't leave. Because leaving meant abandoning the commitment he had made. Leaving meant accepting that everything they had built was based on something unstable. Leaving meant facing a reality that was far more uncertain than the one he was already struggling to manage. So instead, he made a decision. He would take control. He would monitor her behavior. He would try to prevent further deception, to contain whatever was happening before it escalated. It was a decision rooted in logic, in discipline, in the belief that problems could be managed if approached correctly. But it was also a decision that underestimated something critical, the depth of what he was dealing with. Because what Sean saw as a problem to solve was something far more dangerous and far more unpredictable than he could have ever imagined. By the time Sean Scott convinced himself that he could control the situation, the pattern had already evolved beyond anything that could be contained by vigilance alone. What he believed was a matter of discipline, of observation, of intervention, was in reality something far more insidious, something that didn't respond to logic or structure the way a military problem might. It adapted. It shifted. It waited. For the next 2 years, Sean threw himself into his career with even greater intensity, as if distance could serve as both shield and solution. His responsibilities in the Army grew, his days filled with tasks that demanded focus and precision, leaving less time to dwell on the unsettling contradictions that defined his home life. From the outside, it might have looked like progress. A young officer building momentum, advancing steadily along a promising path. But inside his marriage, the silence was deceptive. Wendy didn't stop. She changed. The dramatic fabrications that had once drawn attention began to fade, replaced by something quieter, more controlled. She no longer needed to convince an entire community that she was dying of leukemia. She no longer needed to perform illness on such a grand scale. Instead, the behaviors narrowed, focusing inward, becoming less visible but no less dangerous. Sean noticed it, though not all at once. There were still incidents. Still moments that felt off, that didn't quite align with what he knew to be true. But they were harder to pin down now, less obvious, easier to rationalize. And because he had already made the decision to stay, to manage rather than escape, he found himself filtering those moments through a lens of cautious acceptance. Until April of 2002. The call came without warning. Wendy was in the emergency room. Again. This time, the explanation was tied to her supposed diabetes, a condition Sean had already begun to question, though he had never fully confronted it. As he made his way to the hospital, a familiar tension settled in his chest, a mixture of concern and something else he couldn't quite name. Not fear. Not exactly. Something closer to anticipation. As if part of him already knew what he was about to find. When he arrived, the scene was eerily familiar. The sterile lighting, the controlled urgency, the quiet hum of medical equipment, all of it echoed previous moments, previous crises that had never quite resolved themselves in a way that made sense. But this time, something was different. Something had shifted inside him. He wasn't walking in as the unquestioning husband, the supportive partner willing to accept whatever explanation was offered. He was walking in with doubt, with a growing awareness that the narrative he had been given might not be real. The physician on call greeted him, professional, composed, ready to explain the situation. And before the doctor could begin, Sean spoke. "I respect what you do," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But I need you to understand something. I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that my wife does not have diabetes. She never has." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. For a brief moment, the doctor said nothing. Just looked at him, really looked at him, as if weighing not just the statement, but the man delivering it. Then, after a pause that felt longer than it actually was, the doctor responded with a question that cut straight through the tension. "Would you like me to place her on a 72-hour psychiatric hold?" It was the first time anyone had said it out loud. Not illness, not physical condition, but something else entirely. Something rooted in the mind. Sean didn't hesitate. He agreed. The decision felt both immediate and monumental, as if a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. When he walked back into the room to tell Wendy, he knew what was coming even before he spoke the words. She erupted. Not in quiet distress, not in confusion or fear, but in pure, unfiltered rage. Objects were thrown. Her voice rose, sharp and cutting, filled with anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation, yet entirely consistent with something deeper, something that had been building beneath the surface for years. It wasn't a reaction of someone misunderstood. It was the reaction of someone exposed. And in that moment, any remaining illusions Sean had been holding on to began to collapse. But the unraveling didn't stop there. Because even as Wendy lashed out, even as the situation escalated, there was still one more revelation waiting, one that would complicate everything in ways Sean could never have anticipated. A nurse entered the room, holding a set of results. Routine, procedural. Just another step in the process. Except it wasn't. Wendy was pregnant. The announcement cut through the chaos like a sudden silence, shifting the entire dynamic in an instant. For a brief moment, everything else, the accusations, the psychiatric hold, the years of deception, seemed to fade into the background, replaced by something else entirely. A child. Their child. The implications were immediate and overwhelming. Whatever had been happening between them, whatever questions remained unanswered, they were no longer just about the two of them. There was now another life involved, another responsibility, another reason to stay, to try, to believe that something could still be salvaged. And for a time it seemed like it was. On December 13th, 2002, their daughter was born. She came into the world with complications, hydrocephalus, a condition that would require ongoing medical attention, surgeries, constant monitoring. It was serious, but it was real, tangible, diagnosable, the kind of condition that didn't rely on interpretation or belief. And something unexpected happened. Wendy changed. Almost overnight, the behaviors that had defined her for so long seemed to disappear. The fabricated illnesses, the dramatic episodes, the inconsistencies, they faded, replaced by a focus that appeared genuine, grounded in the needs of their child. For Sean, it felt like a turning point, a resolution. As if the chaos of the past had been leading to this moment, this opportunity for everything to reset, to realign. He allowed himself to believe it. Because he needed to. Because after everything they had been through, the idea that things could finally stabilize, that their family could move forward, was too important to dismiss. And for a while it worked. Their daughter required care, attention, patience. The demands were constant, but they were shared. Sean and Wendy, for the first time in what felt like years, seemed to be working toward the same goal, united by something larger than their own struggles. But stability, in this case, was an illusion. Because while Wendy's focus had shifted, the underlying pattern had not disappeared. It had simply found a new direction. One that would take longer to reveal itself. One that would be far more devastating when it did. In 2004, as Sean balanced his responsibilities between his military duties and his role as a father, new symptoms began to emerge in their daughter. At first, they seemed unrelated: vomiting, irregular eating, persistent diarrhea. The kind of issues that could be attributed to a range of pediatric conditions, especially given her existing medical complications. Doctors ran tests, then more tests, and more. The hospital visits became frequent, then constant. Specialists were consulted, theories proposed, possibilities explored. At one point, leukemia was even considered, echoing a diagnosis that had once been falsely claimed by Wendy herself. But nothing was confirmed. Nothing made sense. And still, the symptoms continued. Over the next 3 years, their daughter underwent hundreds of procedures. Painful, invasive, exhausting procedures that left her physically weakened and emotionally drained. Sean was there for many of them, standing beside her, holding her hand, witnessing the toll it took on her small body. It was unbearable, but it was also, in his mind, necessary. Because they were searching for answers. Because they were trying to save her. Because this was what parents did. What he didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the answer had been there all along. Not in the tests. Not in the diagnoses. But much closer. Hidden in plain sight. And as the investigation slowly began to take shape, as the pieces started to align, the truth that would emerge would not only shatter Sean's understanding of his marriage. It would force him to confront a reality far more horrifying than anything he had faced before. Because this time, the victim wasn't just someone he loved. It was his child. The turning point didn't arrive like a sudden explosion. It crept in quietly, disguised as yet another medical discussion, another attempt to make sense of what no one had been able to explain for years. By June of 2007, exhaustion had settled deep into every part of Sean Scott's life. The endless cycle of hospital visits, unanswered questions, and watching his daughter endure procedure after procedure had worn him down in ways that military training never could. This wasn't a battle he could strategize. There was no enemy to identify, no terrain to map, no plan that guaranteed progress. Only uncertainty.
And pain.
When the call came from the hospital about a multidisciplinary meeting, it didn't immediately feel different from the countless others that had come before. Doctors, specialists, coordinators, all gathering to discuss his daughter's condition, to compare notes, to search for patterns that might finally reveal what was wrong. Sean had sat in rooms like this before, listening to theories rise and fall, watching hope flicker and fade with each inconclusive result. But this time, something shifted the moment he walked in. The room felt heavier. Not tense in the usual way, not filled with the cautious optimism that sometimes accompanied new possibilities. This was something else. Something more deliberate. The doctors weren't searching anymore. They had found something. Wendy sat beside him.
Still. Quiet.
Her presence felt different, though Sean couldn't immediately explain why. There was no dramatic change in her expression, no visible sign that anything extraordinary was about to happen. But there was a stillness in her, a kind of contained energy that didn't match the gravity of the situation. As if she already knew. The lead physician began to speak, his tone measured, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent that was impossible to ignore. He didn't start with speculation. He didn't offer theories.
He presented a fact.
There were abnormal levels of magnesium in their daughter's system. Not slight elevations. Not something that could be explained by diet or medication. Levels that shouldn't have been there. Levels that indicated external introduction. Deliberate introduction. The words settled into the room slowly, each one adding weight, building toward a conclusion that hadn't yet been spoken but was already forming in the minds of everyone present. The doctor continued, his gaze steady, moving between Sean and Wendy. "There is no medical explanation for this," he said, "which means that either you," he gestured toward Sean, "or you," his hand shifted toward Wendy, "or both of you have been giving your daughter magnesium." The accusation didn't come with raised voices or dramatic emphasis. It didn't need to. It was devastating in its simplicity. Sean felt the impact immediately, like a sudden drop beneath his feet. For a fraction of a second, his mind rejected it outright, searching for an alternative, a misunderstanding, anything that could reframe what he had just heard. But before he could speak, before he could even begin to process the implication, Wendy's voice broke the silence. "I did it." There was no hesitation, no confusion, no attempt to deflect or deny. Just a quiet, direct admission. The kind that leaves no room for interpretation. Sean turned to her slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile grip he still had on reality. He searched her face, looking for something: fear, regret, panic, anything that might align with the magnitude of what she had just confessed. But what he saw instead was something far more unsettling.
Calm.
Not complete calm, not indifference, but a strange, almost detached acceptance. As if the act of confessing had released something inside her, something that had been building for years. The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that invites reflection, but the kind that presses down, suffocates, demands acknowledgement. The doctors, professionals trained to handle the worst aspects of human behavior, seemed momentarily frozen, caught between their clinical roles and the raw reality unfolding in front of them. Sean's thoughts fractured. Images collided in his mind, his daughter in hospital beds, pale and weak, the countless procedures she had endured, the nights he had stood beside her, believing he was fighting an invisible illness, the trust he had placed in the person sitting next to him. All of it shifted, rearranged, revealed for what it truly was. This wasn't illness. This wasn't bad luck. This was intentional. "How could you?" he asked, his voice low, strained, barely holding together. The question wasn't just about the act itself. It was about everything. The years of deception, the manipulation, the suffering inflicted on a child who had trusted her completely. Wendy didn't answer. Or maybe she couldn't. Because there was no answer that could bridge the gap between what she had done and what it meant. From that moment, the investigation moved quickly. The military authorities were notified, and the case expanded beyond the hospital walls. What had begun as a medical mystery was now a criminal matter, one that demanded evidence, documentation, proof that could stand in a court of law. An investigator, methodical, experienced, stepped into the situation with a clear objective: understand the behavior, gather the facts, and build a case that left no room for doubt. From the beginning, it was clear this wasn't a typical case. There was a framework for what they were dealing with, a condition known in clinical terms as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. A disorder where a caregiver induces or fabricates illness in another person, often a child, to gain attention, sympathy, or a sense of control. But knowing the term didn't make the reality easier to process. If anything, it made it more disturbing, because it suggested intent.
Pattern.
Premeditation. The investigator approached Wendy differently than one might expect. Instead of confronting her with accusations, instead of focusing on the harm she had caused, the conversation was directed inward, toward her experiences, her feelings, her perspective. It was a deliberate strategy. And it worked. Wendy didn't present as a monster. She didn't match the image people might expect of someone capable of such acts. She appeared soft-spoken, almost childlike in her demeanor, someone who might evoke sympathy rather than suspicion. It was part of what had allowed her behavior to go undetected for so long. But beneath that surface, there was a disconnect, a lack of remorse, an absence of emotional response that should have been there. She spoke about herself, about how things affected her. But when it came to her daughter, the pain, the suffering, the near-fatal consequences, there was a void. And that void spoke louder than any admission. The search of their home revealed more. The evidence wasn't hidden carefully. It didn't need to be, because no one had been looking. In the kitchen trash, a bottle of milk mixed with magnesium sat near the top, as if it had been discarded without concern. In another area, a red medical disposal container held syringes, used, some still containing traces of blood. Not accidental. Not incidental. Deliberate tools. Further examination uncovered something even more chilling. Photographs. Images of their daughter, not just as a child, but as a carefully presented version of one. Her hair styled in tight curls, arranged in a way that made her appear more delicate, more endearing, more likely to draw attention and sympathy from medical staff. It wasn't just about inducing illness. It was about crafting a narrative, creating a character, a sick child who would capture the concern, the care, the focus of everyone around her. And Wendy was at the center of it, the one who brought her in, the one who explained the symptoms, the one who received the attention. The pattern became undeniable. The timing of the symptoms, the preparation beforehand, the escalation of medical interventions. Everything pointed to a level of planning that couldn't be dismissed as impulsive or unintentional. For Sean, the realization was overwhelming. This wasn't a single moment of failure. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was years of calculated behavior, hidden beneath layers of charm, vulnerability, and carefully constructed illusion. And the cost of that illusion had been paid by his daughter. As the investigation continued, one truth became clear above all others. This wasn't going to end quietly. There would be consequences. Legal. Irreversible. And for Sean, the man who had spent his life preparing to face enemies in distant places, the battle ahead would be unlike anything he had ever known. Because this time, there was no strategy that could undo what had already been done. Only the pursuit of justice. And the long, painful process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered from within. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the story had already stripped away every illusion it once held. What remained was not the image of a troubled young mother or a complicated marriage, but a series of undeniable facts, cold, clinical, and devastating. The kind of facts that no amount of charm, no carefully constructed narrative, could soften. The legal process moved forward with a quiet inevitability. After the investigation concluded, the case shifted from federal involvement to state prosecution, where the focus narrowed to a single, urgent objective: accountability. On November 16, 2007, Wendy Scott was formally indicted on multiple charges: first-degree child abuse, second-degree child abuse, assault, reckless endangerment. Each count represented not just a legal violation, but a fragment of the suffering her daughter had endured over years of manipulation and harm. For Sean, the courtroom was a different kind of battlefield. There were no uniforms to hide behind, no chain of command to rely on, no structure that dictated the next step. Instead, there were rows of benches, polished wood, and a silence that carried a different kind of weight. Every word spoken inside that room would shape the outcome, not just legally, but emotionally, permanently. When Wendy entered the courtroom, she didn't appear as someone burdened by the gravity of her actions. She moved lightly, almost casually, her demeanor at odds with the charges she faced. There was a faint smile on her lips, a tendency to glance around as if aware of the attention, as if drawing something from it. To an outside observer, she might have looked like someone attending a routine hearing, not a defendant accused of nearly killing her own child. That contrast unsettled those who had followed the case closely, because it reinforced something that had become increasingly clear during the investigation. Wendy's relationship with attention had not changed. If anything, it had simply shifted environments. On March 13, 2008, the legal strategy became apparent. Wendy pleaded guilty to first-degree child abuse. The decision avoided a prolonged trial, but it did not erase what had happened. It did not soften the facts, nor did it limit the emotional impact of what was about to unfold during sentencing. Instead, it set the stage for a different kind of confrontation, one where the focus would not be on proving guilt, but on determining consequence. And consequence, in this case, carried enormous weight. The prosecution approached the sentencing with clarity and urgency. Their argument was not abstract. It was rooted in evidence, in medical testimony, in the documented suffering of a child who had endured far more than any child ever should.
Doctors took the stand.
Among them was the physician who had been closest to the case, the one who had witnessed firsthand the physical toll inflicted on Sean's daughter. His voice carried not just professional authority, but something deeper. Anger, restrained but unmistakable. He described the blood loss, the repeated withdrawals that had left the child so weakened she required transfusions. Not once, but multiple times. He spoke of the invasive procedures, the tests that had been performed in desperate attempts to diagnose a condition that did not exist. Each procedure carried risk. Each one caused pain. And all of them, in retrospect, had been unnecessary. Because the cause had never been disease. It had been deliberate harm. The courtroom listened in silence as the details unfolded, each one adding to a picture that was already difficult to comprehend. This was not neglect. This was not a moment of poor judgment. This was sustained, calculated abuse. The defense, in response, turned to explanation. Not denial. Not justification. But explanation. They argued that Wendy's actions were the result of a psychological condition, a disorder that influenced her behavior in ways she could not fully control. They introduced diagnoses: borderline personality disorder, factitious disorder imposed on another, terms that sought to frame her actions within the context of mental illness. The implication was clear. She had not intended to harm her child. She had been driven by something beyond her control. But the prosecution countered with a simple, unyielding point. Intent did not erase impact. Wendy knew what she was doing. She knew that withdrawing blood would weaken her daughter. She knew that inducing symptoms would lead to medical intervention. She knew because she had watched it happen repeatedly. And still, she continued. That knowledge, that awareness, made it impossible to dismiss her actions as unintentional. As the hearing progressed, another layer of the story emerged, one that reached beyond the original charges and into Wendy's behavior even after her arrest. While out on bail under supervision participating in counseling, she had continued to fabricate illness. At a new job, she told coworkers she had cancer. She claimed she needed chemotherapy. She staged episodes where she would sit in a hot car until she passed out, ensuring that emergency services would be called. The pattern had not stopped. It had not even slowed. If anything, it had adapted. For the judge, this revelation was critical. It demonstrated that Wendy's behavior was not confined to a specific period or circumstance. It was ongoing, persistent, resistant to intervention. And most importantly, it represented a continued risk, not just to her own children, but to anyone within her sphere of influence. When the time came for sentencing, the courtroom felt still, as if everything had narrowed to a single moment. The judge's words were measured, deliberate. There was no anger in his tone, no dramatic emphasis. But there was certainty. He spoke of the severity of the harm, of the near-fatal consequences, of the responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. And then the sentence. 15 years of active incarceration. 5 years of supervised probation. It was a decision that reflected not just punishment, but prevention. A recognition that the behavior, left unchecked, could not be allowed to continue. For Sean, the moment carried a complex mix of emotions. Relief. That his daughter was safe. That the threat, at least for now, had been contained. But also something heavier. Something harder to define. Because justice, in cases like this, doesn't restore what was lost. It doesn't erase the years of pain, the procedures, the fear, the confusion. It doesn't give a child back the innocence that was taken from her. And it doesn't undo the realization that the person who caused that harm was someone she had trusted completely. After the sentencing, Sean made a decision that marked the final separation from the life he had once known. He removed his wedding ring. A small gesture, outwardly simple, but loaded with meaning. It represented the end of a bond he had once considered unbreakable. The end of a commitment he had fought to preserve, even when it no longer made sense. He filed for divorce. And, before closing that chapter completely, he visited Wendy one last time in jail. The encounter was brief, unsettling. She noticed the absence of the ring immediately, asked about it. Her concern, once again, seemed focused not on what she had done, but on what it meant for her future, for her place in his life. Sean's response was quiet, final. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to salvage. As he walked away from that visit, the weight of 11 years settled behind him, not gone, not forgotten, but contained within a past he could no longer allow to define his future. The legal system had done its part. It had named the crime. It had imposed a sentence. But the deeper work, the healing, the rebuilding, the attempt to create something stable from what had been shattered, that work was just beginning. And it would take far longer than any prison term to complete. In the years that followed the sentencing, there was no single moment where everything suddenly felt whole again. No clear lines separating the past from the present. Healing for Sean Scott and his children did not arrive as a revelation. It came in fragments, small, quiet shifts that only revealed their significance when looked at over time. The house was different now, quieter in some ways but also more honest. There were no more sudden medical emergencies that didn't make sense, no more late-night drives to the hospital fueled by confusion and fear, no more explanations that unraveled under scrutiny. What remained was something simpler, but also more fragile, the task of rebuilding trust from the ground up. For Sean's daughter, the change was almost immediate in a way that felt both relieving and heartbreaking. The symptoms that had once dominated her life began to disappear. The vomiting stopped. The unexplained illnesses faded. The need for constant medical intervention diminished until, eventually, it was gone. No more invasive procedures. No more endless tests. No more pain inflicted in the name of answers. Her body, once treated as a puzzle to be solved, began to return to something closer to normal. But the physical recovery was only part of the story. The deeper wounds, the ones that didn't show up in blood tests or scans, remained. She had learned, at a very young age, that the person meant to protect her could also be the source of her suffering. That kind of lesson doesn't disappear. It lingers. It shapes how a child sees the world, how they understand safety, how they interpret love. And so, the process of healing became something that extended far beyond medical care. It required patience, consistency, and a kind of emotional presence that couldn't be forced or rushed. Sean had to learn a new role, one that no military training had prepared him for, not just a protector, but a steady, reliable source of reassurance in a world that had once felt unpredictable. He focused on creating stability, routine, moments that were simple, repeatable, safe. Things that could anchor his children in something real. Over time, those moments began to accumulate. Small victories. A day without fear. A night without pain. A laugh that came easily, without hesitation. They didn't erase what had happened, but they built something new in its place. For Sean, the journey was equally complex. He had spent years believing that strength meant endurance, that commitment meant staying no matter the cost. Letting go of that belief was not easy. It required him to confront the possibility that sometimes the strongest decision is not to endure, but to walk away. That realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded gradually, shaped by reflection, by conversations, by the quiet understanding that what he had experienced was not something he could simply move past without acknowledging its impact. There were moments when the past surfaced unexpectedly. A question from his children. A fragment of a thought that refused to settle. But over time, those moments became less overwhelming. Not because they disappeared, but because they were no longer in control. They became part of his story, rather than the force defining it. And then, slowly, something else began to take shape. Connection. Not the kind that emerges from shared trauma, but the kind that grows from mutual understanding, from respect, from the recognition of someone else's strength. Sean met Rachel during a period when both of them were navigating their own transitions. Their connection didn't begin with intensity or urgency. It started with conversation, with friendship, with a quiet awareness that they understood each other in ways that didn't need to be explained. Rachel saw Sean clearly. Not just as a soldier, not just as a father, but as someone who had carried more than most people could see. And instead of being intimidated by that, she responded with something steady, something grounded. Support. Not overwhelming. Not performative. Just present. As their relationship developed, it brought something new into Sean's life. Balance. A sense that he didn't have to carry everything alone, that it was possible to build something healthy, something stable, even after everything that had come before. In 2010, they married. It wasn't just the union of two people. It was the blending of families, the creation of a new environment where healing could continue, supported by structure, by care, by consistency. For Sean's children, Rachel became more than a stepmother. She became a source of safety, someone who provided the kind of nurturing presence they had been missing. But even as life moved forward, the past wasn't entirely silent. While Sean was deployed to Afghanistan, Wendy attempted to reduce her sentence. It was a calculated move, timed in a way that ensured he wouldn't be present to respond. The request brought everything back into focus, forcing the family to confront the possibility that the chapter they had tried to close might not be fully over. Rachel stepped forward. She attended the hearing in his place, carrying not just her own voice, but the weight of the children's experiences. Sitting in that courtroom, facing the person who had caused so much harm, she felt the tension of two conflicting impulses, the instinct to protect and the need to remain composed. When Wendy took the stand, her demeanor hadn't changed. She spoke about herself, her progress, her perception of her own transformation. But when asked directly about what she had done to her daughter, the clarity disappeared. The answers became vague, uncertain, evasive. She could not, or would not, fully acknowledge the reality of her actions. And in that moment, it became clear that some things had not changed at all. Rachel read a statement on behalf of the family, a reflection of the lasting impact, the daily effort required for Sean's daughter to live a life that others might take for granted, the resilience she had shown, the strength it took to move forward despite everything. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The truth, spoken plainly, carried its own weight. When the judge denied the request for a reduced sentence, it reinforced what had already been understood. The risk remained. The accountability would not be lessened. And the focus would continue to be on protecting those who had already endured too much. As the years passed, the space between the past and the present grew wider. Not erased, but less immediate. Sean continued his military career, eventually achieving the rank of lieutenant colonel, a milestone that carried its own significance, given how close everything had come to being lost. His children grew, each one shaped by their experiences, but not defined by them. They found their own paths, their own ways of understanding what had happened, and how to move beyond it. And Sean, in his own way, found something that had once felt impossible. Peace. Not perfect peace. Not the absence of memory or pain, but a state where the past no longer controlled the present, where the lessons learned, however painful, could be used to help others. Because that became part of his purpose. To speak. To share. To reach those who might find themselves in situations that didn't make sense, that felt wrong but were difficult to define. He understood now how easy it was to overlook warning signs, to rationalize behavior, to remain in situations that slowly erode clarity. And he wanted others to see what he hadn't seen, to act before it was too late, to trust their instincts, to seek help. Because the most dangerous threats are often the ones that don't look like threats at all. They wear familiar faces. They speak in familiar voices. They exist in places where trust is assumed, not questioned. Sean's story is not just one of survival. It is a reminder that strength is not just about enduring hardship. It is about recognizing when something is wrong, about having the courage to confront it, and about choosing, even after everything, to build something better from what remains. His children carry that legacy now, not as victims, but as individuals who endured something unimaginable and found a way to move forward.
stronger,
wiser, and no longer defined by the darkness that once surrounded them. Because in the end, what defines a life is not the worst thing that happens within it, but what is built in its aftermath. If there is a moment where a story like this truly ends, it is not in the courtroom, not with the sound of a sentence being delivered, and not even with the quiet closing of a prison door. It ends somewhere much less visible, in the private spaces where people sit with what they have lived through and decide, piece by piece, what they will carry forward and what they will leave behind. For Sean Scott, that ending did not come all at once. It revealed itself in fragments. In the way his daughter could laugh without fear interrupting the moment. In the way his son could grow up in a home where illness was no longer a performance, but something understood, treated, and respected when real. In the way silence, once heavy with tension and uncertainty, became something softer, something that no longer needed to be filled with explanations or excuses. There was a time when Sean believed that understanding Wendy, her behavior, her motivations, her disorder, might somehow bring closure. That if he could map it out, analyze it, place it within a framework, it would make sense in a way that felt manageable. But some things do not resolve that way. Some things remain incomplete. And learning to live with that incompleteness is its own form of resolution. What he came to understand instead was simpler, and in many ways more difficult. Not everything that happens in a life can be fully explained in a way that satisfies the need for order. Some actions exist beyond logic, beyond reason, shaped by forces that do not follow the rules most people live by. And when those actions cause harm, the focus cannot remain on understanding the person who caused it. It has to shift to the people who survived it, to the work of rebuilding, to the responsibility of ensuring it does not happen again. That shift became central to everything Sean did moving forward. He no longer measured his strength by how much he could endure, but by how clearly he could see, by how willing he was to question, to act, to protect, even when doing so meant confronting uncomfortable truths. Because the hardest lesson he had learned was not about deception. It was about hesitation, about the small moments where something feels wrong, but is dismissed. The quiet doubts that are pushed aside in favor of maintaining peace. The instinct to protect a relationship, even when that relationship begins to erode something essential. He had lived through the consequences of that hesitation. And he understood in a way few people ever have to how dangerous it can be. There were conversations he would later have, sometimes with close friends, sometimes in more public settings, where people would ask how it was possible not to see it sooner. How someone so disciplined, so trained to assess risk, could remain in a situation that, in hindsight, seemed filled with warning signs. The answer was never simple, because the signs, when experienced in real time, did not appear as a clear pattern. They appeared as isolated moments. A strange behavior here, an inconsistency there, each one explainable on its own, each one small enough to overlook. It was only when they were placed together, when viewed as part of a larger whole, that their true meaning became visible. But by then, the damage had already been done. That realization stayed with him, not as a source of regret, but as a point of clarity, because it allowed him to understand something critical. Awareness is not just about recognizing obvious danger. It is about paying attention to the subtle, the quiet, the things that do not immediately demand attention but slowly accumulate into something significant. And that awareness is something that must be practiced. Actively.
consistently.
Especially in the places where people feel most comfortable, most secure, most unwilling to question what they believe to be true. Sean's story, when told in full, does not follow the structure most people expect from narratives about crime and justice. There is no clean arc where everything resolves neatly, where every question is answered, where every consequence feels proportionate. Instead, it leaves behind something more complex, a reflection of how human behavior can defy expectation, how trust can be manipulated in ways that are difficult to detect, how the most dangerous situations are often the ones that develop slowly, quietly, over time. But it also leaves behind something else. Evidence of resilience. Not the dramatic, visible kind that draws attention, but the quieter form that builds over years. The kind that shows itself in consistency, in effort, in the willingness to keep moving forward even when the path is unclear. Sean's children embody that resilience. They carry with them the reality of what they experienced, but they are not defined by it. They have grown in environments shaped by honesty, by care, by a commitment to doing things differently. They have learned through both hardship and support what it means to rebuild trust, not as something given automatically, but as something earned and maintained. And Sean, in his own way, continues that work, not by revisiting the past endlessly, but by using it with purpose. To remind, to warn, to encourage action in moments where doubt might otherwise lead to silence. Because if there is one message that emerges clearly from everything he has lived through, it is this. When something feels wrong, it deserves attention. Not dismissal, not delay. Attention. Questions should be asked. Concerns should be voiced. Help should be sought. Because the cost of ignoring those instincts can be far greater than the discomfort of confronting them. The story that began in a small town, with two young people whose lives seemed full of promise, did not end the way anyone would have imagined. It unfolded into something far darker, far more complicated, leaving behind consequences that could not be undone. But it did not end in destruction. It did not end in silence. It continued, through healing, through growth, through the deliberate choice to build something stronger from what remained. And in that continuation, there is something worth holding on to. Not because it erases what happened, but because it proves that even in the aftermath of profound harm, it is possible to create a future that is not defined by it. A future shaped instead by awareness, by resilience, and by the quiet determination to protect what matters most. There is a silence that follows stories like this, but it is not empty. It is filled with questions that don't fade, only change shape over time. Questions about how something so deliberate could exist behind something so familiar. Questions about how love, trust, and commitment, things most people rely on to build their lives, can be used as cover for something destructive. And, perhaps the most unsettling question of all, would you have seen it? Sean Scott has asked himself that question more times than he can count. Not in a way that traps him in the past, but in a way that sharpens his understanding of it. Because when he looks back, what he sees is not a single moment where everything could have been stopped. There was no obvious turning point where one decision would have changed everything. Instead, there was a series of moments, small, quiet, almost insignificant on their own, where something didn't feel right. A detail that didn't line up. A story that shifted slightly. A reaction that seemed just a little too intense. Or not intense enough. Each of those moments passed quickly. Each one was absorbed into the flow of daily life, explained away by context, by emotion, by the simple human tendency to preserve what feels important. Because relationships, especially ones built over years, are not easily questioned. They are protected, often instinctively, even when the evidence begins to suggest that something beneath them is unstable. That is where the danger lives. Not in the obvious, but in the familiar, in the routines that feel safe, in the patterns that go unexamined because they don't immediately demand attention. What Sean came to understand is that deception, when it is sustained over time, does not rely on constant performance. It relies on consistency, on being believable often enough that the inconsistencies are overlooked, on creating a version of reality that feels close enough to the truth that people stop questioning it. Wendy had done exactly that. She didn't invent an entirely separate life. She built on what was already there. A real personality, real relationships, real vulnerabilities. And then she layered something else on top of it, something subtle at first, then more pronounced, then eventually impossible to ignore. But by the time it reached that point, the foundation had already been laid. The trust had already been established. And trust, once given, is difficult to retract. Not because people are unwilling to see the truth, but because seeing it requires them to accept that something they believed in, something they invested in, was not what it appeared to be. That acceptance is not easy. It challenges identity. It forces a reevaluation of memory, of judgment, of self-perception. For Sean, that process was gradual. It required him to look at his own decisions without defensiveness, to understand why he stayed, why he believed, why he chose to manage rather than leave. And what he found was not weakness, but something more complicated. Loyalty, responsibility, faith. Values that in most situations are strengths. But in this one, they had been used against him. That realization carries a kind of weight that doesn't disappear. It becomes part of how a person sees the world moving forward. Not as a source of constant suspicion, but as a reminder that even the strongest qualities can become vulnerabilities in the wrong context. And so, the story does not end with a warning about others alone. It also carries a quiet reflection on the self, on the importance of balance, of knowing when to hold on and when to let go, when to trust and when to question, when to endure and when to step away. These are not simple decisions. They rarely come with clear answers, but they matter because they shape not just outcomes, but the paths that lead to them. Sean's life now is not defined by what happened, but it is informed by it. There is a difference. He does not wake up each day reliving the past, but he carries its lessons in the way he moves through the present, in the way he listens, in the way he responds when something feels off, even if he cannot immediately explain why. He has learned to respect that instinct, to treat it not as something to suppress, but as something to examine. Because sometimes the first signal that something is wrong does not come as a clear thought. It comes as a feeling, a subtle shift, a moment of discomfort that doesn't have an obvious source. And ignoring that feeling, dismissing it without question, can allow something dangerous to take root. For his children, the future is still unfolding. They carry with them the memory of what they endured, but also the experience of what came after, the support, the stability, the rebuilding of trust in an environment that values honesty over appearance. They have seen, in real terms, what harm looks like, but also what recovery requires. That dual understanding will shape them, not in ways that limit them, but in ways that give them perspective. Strength that is grounded not in avoidance of difficulty, but in the ability to face it and move through it. And perhaps that is where the story finds its most meaningful conclusion. Not in the events themselves, but in what follows them, in the choices made afterward, in the decision to not allow what happened to define everything that comes next. Because stories like this can easily become consumed by their darkest elements. The details of the crime, the shock of the revelation, the complexity of the psychology involved. All of those things matter. They deserve attention, understanding, examination. But they are not the only part of the story. There is also what comes after. The rebuilding, the redefining, the quiet, persistent effort to create something better. Sean Scott's story is not one of perfection or of easy answers. It is a story of complexity, of human behavior that defies expectation, of trust that was broken, and the long process of learning how to trust again. And ultimately, it is a story about awareness, about the importance of paying attention, not just to what is said, but to what is felt, not just to what is visible, but to what lies beneath it. Because the difference between safety and harm is not always obvious. Sometimes it is found in the details most people overlook. And sometimes it is found in the courage to look at those details closely, even when doing so is uncomfortable. That is the lesson that remains. Quiet, but enduring. A reminder that the truth is not always loud, but it is always there, waiting to be seen.